By the spring of 1990, the NES and Famicom were no strangers to wrestling games. Real-life wrestling fans during this era, including myself, were still waiting on an NES game that successfully blended the actual larger-than-life stars we watched on television with our beloved Nintendo console. We know that high and mighty promotion to the north called the WWF had already released Wrestlemania for the NES in January of 1989, but it's a fair argument that this game didn't meet its full potential. But if you were from the South or happened to have the TBS Superstation growing up, you were probably just as much of a fan of World Championship Wrestling and its iconic wrestlers like Ric Flair, Sting, and of course the Road Warriors. The team at WCW finally decided to enter the video game universe when World Championship Wrestling released on the NES in April of 1990, and it featured many of the critical elements that make pro wrestling appealing to its fan base. Now rest assured, fans, that we will discuss all the strategies and tips you need to succeed in this game. But no development story behind a Southern Wrestling Promotions video game would be complete without a little backstage drama, politics, and cronyism that greatly influenced the final product that ended up in our living rooms. And I can't wait to share all the secrets and history with you in today's video. So let's get started. And if this is your first time here at the channel, my name is Tyler, and if you love gaming from all generations like we do here at G3, then consider hitting that subscribe button and hit that bell for notifications so you don't miss anything. Much like the video game industry, professional wrestling must constantly progress and evolve in order to stay relevant with the current consumer, and the dawning of the 1990s was certainly no exception to that rule. This era was dominated by the WWF in the northeastern US and Jim Crockett Promotions based in the southeast. JCP's partnership with media mogul Ted Turner was the key component to their national success, with Turner giving them weekly airtime on his Atlanta-based superstation TBS, who by the summer of 1988 was in 49 million households. But while its wrestling stars were becoming household names, lavish company spending and creative issues behind the scenes had Jim Crockett Promotions on the verge of bankruptcy. This would ultimately end with Turner Broadcasting System purchasing the promotion from the Crockett's in November 1988, with Turner rebranding the company as World Championship Wrestling. By the time WCW would plan to discuss developing an NES game, which appears to be around the summer of 1989 based on the video game's roster, tensions were high amongst the infamous WCW booking committee. Turner had appointed a successful TV station manager and regional Pizza Hut manager named Jim Herd as executive vice president, despite his lack of professional wrestling experience. The remainder of the committee would be comprised of creative minds that were well respected in the wrestling world, such as Jim Cornette, Jim Ross, and Ric Flair, to name a few. During a 2020 interview with wrestling podcaster Conrad Thompson, Jim Herd, who is now 88 years old, stated that he wanted to focus on the 8 to 11-year-old male target demographic. So while Herd didn't specifically name the NES game, I'm sure that this mentality is what finally made them venture into creating a video game. But it did not take much researching for me to figure out that Turner Broadcasting was only concerned about the bottom line when it came to its NES game. Because World Championship Wrestling on the NES is just a reskin wrestling title that was released on the Famicom in 1989, named Superstar Pro Wrestling. Superstar Pro Wrestling featured an all-star roster of Japanese and American wrestlers who work for All Japan and New Japan Pro Wrestling. Notable grapplers include Antonio Inoki, Giant Baba, Bruiser Brody, Big Van Vader, and even Abdullah the Butcher. But the obvious main connection to the WCW game is that Animal and Hawk from the legendary tag team the Road Warriors are featured in both the Famicom and NES titles. Surely both the creative wrestling and corporate minds at WCW agreed that using the Road Warriors as the main attraction for marketing the NES game was a great strategy. It is well documented that Ted Turner was focused on continuing to expand his media empire globally, which included establishing relationships with large Japanese media conglomerates, such as Fujisankei Communications International, by granting FCI a license to the Turner-owned Gone with the Wind movie. So it's no surprise that Turner would call upon FCI to publish World Championship Wrestling for the NES, given that their affiliate Pony Canyon had published Superstar Pro Wrestling in Japan. So in April of 1990, WCW fans would finally take control of their favorite wrestlers when World Championship Wrestling released on the NES in North America. 12 of the promotion's top stars were at your disposal, which all coincided with the original wrestlers from Superstar Pro Wrestling, such as Lex Luger being based on Antonio Inoki, and Ric Flair based on Giant Baba. In fact, the only wrestler that was an unchanged character from the Famicom title was Road Warrior Animal. I always felt that wrestlers like Flair, Luger, Sting, Ricky Steamboat, the Road Warriors, and Rick Steiner's charisma and style translated well to a video game, as they had that larger-than-life it factor. Now, while all of these wrestlers are well respected by fans in the wrestling community alike, I do think that personal biases and backstage politics had a lot to do with who made the final roster. My point is that if Jim Herd and Turner Broadcasting wanted to focus on the 8 to 11-year-old male demographic, then I was the target fan at that time because I love video games too. I mean, I even dressed up as Animal for Halloween one year. But the other characters, while I did know them from watching on TBS, did not check all of my boxes as a young wrestling fan. And I wouldn't be surprised if Jim Herd felt the same way. But remember when I said earlier that Jim Herd managed WCW with a committee? Well, Kevin Sullivan and Eddie Gilbert just so happened to be on that committee. And Jim Ross, who is not a wrestler himself, was extremely loyal to his friend and fellow University of Oklahoma alumnus, Dr. Death Steve Williams. Again, I'm not trying to upset any fans or people in the wrestling community with my opinions, because I know these guys were legitimate, tough, and skilled athletes, with unfortunately Gilbert and Williams no longer being with us today. But just from a young male fan's perspective at the time, I just don't think they were the best examples to target for a video game. Who do you think would have been the best inclusions from the roster in mid-1989? One of the more memorable aspects of World Championship Wrestling on the NES was the animated title screen, which incorporated a digitized voice, which I felt was pretty impressive for 1990.
World Championship Wrestling!
And a fun bit of trivia is that heel manager Paul E. Dangerously provided the voice for the title screen. But I'm still shocked that a digitized Ric Flair woo wasn't implemented in this game. I mean, there was even a woo on the back of the Superstar Pro Wrestling box, but it's nowhere to be found in an official WCW game with Ric Flair. I mean, now come on. Even more impressive is how World Championship Wrestling on the NES accurately captures in-ring wrestling action. The grappling move sets are slightly different for each wrestler, and the player gets to choose which 4 grappling moves they prefer to use. These moves are wonderfully animated and look like legitimate pile drivers, atomic drops, Boston crabs, cobra twist abdominal stretches, and the list goes on. And the rumbling of the screen during submission moves adds an immersive tension. But the most impressive inclusion in this game are the finishers for each wrestler. Yes, you can actually perform signature moves before pinning your opponent, just like your favorite wrestlers you watched on TV as a kid. Rick Steiner's belly-to-belly suplex, Steve Williams' Oklahoma Stampede, and Sting's Scorpion Deathlock look especially great in 8-bit. Now, while the moves and finishers in World Championship Wrestling are impressive, executing these moves aren't as easy as it sounds. So it's now time to discuss the basic strategies I believe are critical to earning that coveted WCW Championship belt. And I'll even throw in a few passwords so you can experience some fun advantages and an Easter egg. I know there are both singles and tag team modes available in this game, but I'm going to focus the strategies and secrets around singles competition, because the same can be applied to the tag team action. Basic moves common to each wrestler, such as Irish whips and body slams, are executed by holding the B button and corresponding D-pad directions noted here in the manual. and the 4 favorite moves that you can choose at the select screen are performed similarly by holding the A button, although you want to release the A button when the power bar is at its highest to inflict the most damage. But before you can attempt any of these moves, you must weaken your opponent to his knees to successfully lock up. This is accomplished by landing multiple kicks or punches to your enemy, and this is unfortunately where I feel the game is brutally set up in the computer's favor. No matter how much I spam kicks, I can never consistently deal kicks more effectively than my opponent. The first tip I recommend to anyone playing this game for the first time is to definitely use a turbo controller. And I prefer the NES Max because it makes your life so much more easy, and I am not ashamed to admit it. My second tip is to never let your opponent rest for 1 second during the match. I like to control the pace of the match by immediately picking up my opponent off the mat with the B button, and then I can get into a steady kicking and combo move rhythm that will wear him down quickly. If your timing somehow gets off and you can tell he may land a few kicks on you, just dash away by pressing the D-pad away from your opponent while pressing A and B simultaneously. My third tip is to only use wrestlers who have running attacks that don't involve a kick move, such as a drop kick, because it leaves you vulnerable if you miss the attack. Remember, you can always take advantage of the out-of-the-ring 20-second countout for quick victories, similar to strategies we've discussed in our Nintendo's Pro Wrestling Secrets and History video. But I think it's so special to experience the finishers in World Championship Wrestling by tapping the A and B buttons simultaneously in the center of the ring when your opponent's power is hanging by a thread, shortly followed by a 3-count pinfall or dramatic submission victory. After defeating all 11 wrestlers, you are only awarded the WCW Minor Championship. So if you want to be the true WCW champion, you must defeat the entire roster a second time, before facing off with the final opponent, the WCW Master. And he is a masked wrestler whose large stature is billed at 7 feet 4 inches tall, and the fact that he wrestles in a singlet doesn't leave much mystery that Andre the Giant was the true inspiration for this character. And wrestling fans would note that the mask is a nod to Andre's giant machine gimmick he used in Japan. The WCW Master match is tough. The match is set up to where you have to slowly chop the giant down to score a victory. Dedicate the first 2 minutes of the match to barraging the master with kicks, and it's even better if you can get him against the ropes. After the 2 minutes, you can try running attacks like the lariat to knock him down. You have to remain patient and understand that you must inflict a ton of damage before you can score a final pin, which you can attempt from the top rope when the clock starts winding down by tapping the A button to finally become the true WCW champion. This little Easter egg password shown here actually allows you to wrestle as WCW Master, which is a fun little novelty, but the graphics get kind of wonky throughout the match, so don't expect to make a full run of the title with the Giant. Much like the WWF overshadowed WCW in wrestling pop culture during the dawn of the 90s, iconic NES wrestling titles like Pro Wrestling and Tecmo World Wrestling often dominate the 8-bit wrestling conversation even to this day. It is estimated that over 100,000 copies of World Championship Wrestling were sold for the NES, with both the WCW promotion and their video game representations continuing to hone their craft until reaching their full potentials during the mid to late 90s. But I strongly feel that World Championship Wrestling is a respectable and must-have affordable wrestling title for any NES collector or old-school wrestling fan today. Special shout out to Blake the Bacon Boy for finding Mullet Boy first in our last Excitebike Secrets and History video. Till next time, guys. G3 out.